chapter, chapter 13, and this one is about market failure. We talked about this a bit before. We know that markets work well at allocating resources, except when they don't. And there's lots of issues when they don't, and then what do we do about it? So what does market failure mean? Well, it occurs when the outcome that the market provides isn't socially optimal. And what do we mean by that? It means that the level of output, the amount of goods and services we're getting, is not appropriate. It's either too much of a bad thing, and that's something called a negative externality. We'll go through that. Or it's not enough of a good thing, and that's something called a positive externality, and we will go through that as well. A couple other instances, public goods. That's another one, and we will study that just briefly here because we've touched on it before. In chapters that come later, we're going to look at income inequality. That's another instance where the market doesn't give us the best outcome. So let's start with this. Let's start with externalities. So what is an externality? An externality is, let's see if I can get this out of the way a bit so you guys can see everything that's on here. And by the way, all of these slides are in the files. So an externality is an action or a transaction that affects a third party who is not a party to it. It's a crazy definition, isn't it? But what it's trying to say is there is this thing called a spillover effect that affects this other entity that's not usually in this transaction. Usually we have the buyers and the sellers, you know, the consumers and the producers, and now there's this third party. What we mean by party is person or entity, and usually what that is referring to is society as a whole. And so if they're not a part of this, then they're being harmed or hurt, and we're not taking into account what's happening to them. So there's a positive externality. That's when these benefits, these spillover effects, something that's affecting the other party, the third party, society, is positive. And so in those cases, the market doesn't give us enough of these good things, like vaccines and education. There could also be a time when the spillover, the effect to the third party is something negative, and then that's a cost. So that's things like pollution and noise. So those are the ones that we see there. So what does this look like? Let's go through what this looks like as a model. I'm going to move this up here. Okay, so maybe you can see all this. Yes, yes. Good, good. There we go. Okay, so what's going on here? Oops, maybe you can't see this. I'm sorry. I thought I figured all this out beforehand. So what's going on here is we've got negative externalities, and this is a case where we have a negative or a harm spilling over to society. So where we used to look at things, where we used to see what the market would return is here, right? And we call that market, Q market. That's just where the supply, and here's supply, intersects demand. We're calling supply now SP for the private amount of supply. And so those are the firms. So this is our marginal private cost. This is just what firms are looking at doing regardless of how it affects society. That's all that we used to study before. So there's our price and there's our quantity. But now we know that there's something unique about this product. It's when in the production process, there's harm created from it. So it's having a negative spillover effect that's harming society. Pollution. Think about tires being manufactured. They put, bad pollution into the air. When a firm looks at making tires, they don't look at, oh, the cost of pollution, we need to build that into our models and take that into account. They just think, what's the cost of making the tire and how can I profit maximize? But if they did take into account that external cost, that's why this is called an externality, that spillover cost, that harm that's creating more of a problem that the pollution is causing, that would be the distance here, the vertical distance between these two curves, and we have now something called the supply overall for society. It's what society would want. It's our marginal social cost. This is actually the supply curve we should be taking into account to give us the socially optimal amount of this product. So here is the rub. This is where the failure is. The market, Q market, is too high. The quantity in the market of this thing is too high. We're allowing there to be harm to society, pollution. Society would want QS, less of this thing. So an external cost shifts the supply curve up and to the left. The market produces more output than is socially optimal. This is a negative externality. This is what we consider a market failure. So what can we do about it? Well, one of the things we could do about it is we can create a tax. And you've probably heard about carbon taxes. A tax is something that shifts the supply curve, right? So when we put a tax on a firm, it shifts the supply curve back and to the left. So if we can have an idea of exactly how much harm is happening per unit, we could put a tax on this producer and create the cost. They internalize the externality. They create a cost on their books that will make it so that they will supply less. So we do an emission tax, let's say, on all of that pollution. And so that's a tax on every unit of pollution that's produced. And that's how we get back to achieve that socially optimal outcome. If we think about it, let's just go ahead and put a tax that shifts the supply curve back into the left so that the supply curve for society is exactly equal to the supply curve that the firm would choose on its own. But the case with taxes, it's sometimes really hard to know the correct amount, and not every firm is as efficient at reducing production as possible. So another way we can handle an externality is with something called a market-based policy, and you'll hear those as cap and trade or tradable permits. And what this does is, rather than creating a tax, rather than identifying that there's this too much of a bad thing in the market, what we do is we say there's a certain amount of pollution, certain amount of harm that we will allow, whatever it is. So it sets a maximum allowable quantity of this production, given that there's going to be a certain amount of harm. And then we sell and grant the rights to pollute, in this case, for that harm. So we divvy it up, we sell permits. You're allowed to emit this many, pollution units. I don't know what it would be in. And so then firms who are in this production field, let's say it's tire manufacturers again, they have to buy these permits, and it allows them to pollute. If they do a good job and reduce their pollution below what they are permitted to allow to produce, they can sell those additional pollution rights. So these permits can be bought and sold on a market. That's the key. We cap the production, cap the pollution, cap the harm, and trade. And the trade makes it so that firms that are good and efficient and know how to reduce pollution, they have an asset, extra permits they can sell. And the firms that are not very good at efficiently reducing pollution, they get fined. They have to go buy more permits. So it's a good way of reducing the quantity of this harm, but doing it in an efficient manner, using the market forces to do it. And then what's brilliant is we can slowly reduce the amount of permits each year. We can slowly reduce the amount of the maximum of allowed harm. And that's another way to efficiently get back to a socially optimal outcome. And I've put a little link in here if you guys want to look. This happens at the Air Resources Board. They're doing a cap and trade program right now. So this is something that's happening in the real world. And then you may have also heard about a carbon tax and a dividend. The idea there is we want to address this negative externality, put a tax on these producers who are polluting and causing harm, and then let consumers get a dividend, get the money from that tax, so they get some sort of buy-in. Let's go through a positive externality. What does a positive externality look like? So a positive externality looks like this. And the idea here is that there's some sort of spillover that's helping consumers, helping the market, and we don't have enough of this thing. So rather than having two supply curves, we have two demand curves. This demand curve is private demand, marginal private benefit. This is what consumers, this is what we studied before, that's how much they would want of this good. Demand S here, that's what society would demand. That's our marginal social benefit, and that's what we would like to see happen, that we're not getting. So we actually want more of this quantity. You can see the quantity in the market is lower than the quantity that would be socially optimal. And that is exactly the definition of a positive externality. We have not enough of a good thing. On its own, firms can't make enough money, providing vaccines, let's say. So they don't invest and they don't give us as much as we really would want. So maybe you can think about what would we do to help create more of a socially optimal outcome here. We want to increase the quantity. We want to increase production of these things. Education, great example. So we fund them with subsidies. That's what a student loan theoretically should be, or grants. So we would subsidize these firms, and that would be a way to shift the demand curve up and to the right, so the private demand curve would equal what society wants, and we would have a socially optimal outcome. So that's a little bit about externalities. Let's just briefly look at public goods one more time. Remember, public goods are things that the market cannot figure out how to provide on its own because they are not able to prevent people from getting this product if they don't pay for it. So that's that non-excludability. Once a good or service is provided, it is not possible to exclude others from enjoying it. That's the problem with public goods. We can't do that. Another thing is non-rival. firms can't figure out how to prevent one person from consuming it and another person consuming it at the same time. So consumption by one does not reduce that of another. So that's that free rider problem with public goods. The market won't give us the right amount. So what do we need? We need government to come in and provide those goods. Things like firefighting services, national defense. We went through these, so I'm just hitting on this briefly. And then a couple other specific examples that your book goes through that you'll get some questions about. We can have varying degrees where something is non-rival, but it is excludable. In this case, non-excludable, but it is rival. So we call that a common property resource, like a public beach. We can't prevent people from coming onto this beach, but if we have too many people using it, then we can't all enjoy it. So it's non-excludable, but rival. That's another time where we have trouble with the market giving us the right amount of a good. And finally, another example is when we have these common property resources, they can be overused. And the problem with that is that we get this tragedy of the commons. And this happens a lot with fishing, for example. So it's like a common property. There are areas in the water that aren't, oceans that belong to anybody. So everybody can go there and fish. And there's no problem then because everybody's using it, but it gets used up. And so we get overfishing. So that's a common property resource problem called tragedy of the commons. It's a market failure. We used to have it back in the olden days in England with overgrazing of certain lawns. So that's what I want to say, the main points from this chapter. And remember, the slides are all in the files. So I will stop there. Thanks. And get in touch with me if you have questions.